Welcome to the creative community. I'm your host, David Starkey, and my guest this time is poet Chryss Yost. Chryss, welcome.
Thank you.
But it's great to have you here. I've known you as a poet since about the time I arrived in Santa Barbara, and you are someone who's been involved in the local poetry scene for a long time. We're going to talk about that a good bit and get some local connections. But I'd like to start off by hearing how you got involved with poetry yourself.
Well, I always loved reading, always loved literature. Poetry came to me mostly studying with John Ridland at UCSB. I'd studied before at City College, had a great class with Jerry Pike there, and we had a textbook called Literature and Introduction that was edited by X.J. Kennedy and Dana Gioia.
Right.
And later I was writing poems with John, and some of those formal poems that I wrote with him were later included in literature, when I was very happy about that.
So you'd come full circle, yeah.
So I kind of came full circle. I was really excited about that. But I would have to say John Ridland was really the person who got me started with formal poetry. I'd been writing poems since I was a little girl, but never seriously. I never felt like there was a specific craft to poetry. I could find beautiful words, but I loved what formal poetry brought for me was just that idea that they belong in a specific structure. And I love that structure.
Do you remember a specific poem that you'd read that just struck out for you and you said, this is the way it is, or a series of poems?
There was a series of poems. There was a book called Rebel Angels, and it's all contemporary poets, and their poems are written on topics that I could really relate to. You know, they were like drinking beer and like barking dogs. And after studying a lot of Shakespeare and Dickinson, things like that, which were beautiful, but at the same time seemed very distant. I loved hearing more modern voices, a sense of humor. I love hearing a sense of humor in poetry, and that really made me think about expanding my own poetry more seriously.
Well, one of the things I want to do today is to have you read a lot of poems, and so shall we go ahead and get started? Tell us about the first one that you want to read.
Well, I was going to bring, I brought a poem that was written for the butterfly exhibit at the Santa Barbara Natural History Museum, and you organized that reading, kind of facilitated it. That's been one of the great pleasures about being a poet in Santa Barbara, is collaborating you know, with the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. And this one was at the Natural History Museum, and you know, we were writing kind of inspired by these butterflies. So this is one called Old Habits. I needed to renounce familiar things. I wasn't going away, I thought, but towards. Now, pulled out of black waters, wet towels draped across my back, my old home will not hold me anymore. Who can teach a caterpillar joy? When comfortable with creeping, she must fly. Craving leaves, she finds her teeth are gone. And though her life has been a holding on, she no longer feels steady on her branch. When does she forget her other parts? The wrapping paper wings around her hungry, crawling heart.
That's great.
So.
I remember that poem vividly. That was a really interesting night because I had been inspired by seeing all these butterflies in the netting and called them up. And we were able to read in that beautiful hall. There weren't many people there, but it was a really grand occasion.
It was. It was fun.
Let's hear another one. What's the next thing you've got for us?
Well, I brought a terzinelle, and this is a more formal poem. This is a good example, I think, of a formal poem.
Okay, can you describe the form?
The form is that there's a lot of repeats between the different lines of where they're all in 3-line stanzas, and where the first line will become, the first line of one stanza will become the third line of a next.
Okay.
So you'll hear a lot of the lines repeated. And one of the challenges is to make them sound a little different each time, use them differently. And for me, since I kind of tend to make the same mistakes over and over in my life, it's easy for me to use these kind of repeating forms. I'm kind of drawn to them. And this one's called Terzinelle in Blonde because it's, you know, one of my great reactions to stress is just to change my hair, like, you know.
I noticed.
Yeah, and now I have, you know, I think when you met me, I had long blonde hair, and now I have short, darker hair. It's been red, it's been blue. It's one of my favorite ways of self-transformation. I don't grow wings like a butterfly, I just kind of change my hair. So this is Terzinelle in Blonde. Some things can be changed, not yesterday, and not your leaving me. I'll dye my hair. This blonde is too much yours for me today. Too long and sentimental, unaware. The insistent if of blonde, and then, and not you're leaving me. I'll dye my hair until it's black as yours, and then again. I'll dye until it's red or gray to drown the insistent if of blonde, and then your words becoming tied to hers. The sound of lovers' voices should be mine with yours. I'll dye until it's red or gray to drown the echo of your whispers on my shoulders, to saturate the swish of my own heart, of lovers' voices. Should be mine with yours, tangled up for days, not torn apart. Some things can be changed, not yesterday, not your leaving, not the hardest part. This blonde is too much yours for me today.
Great. So now talk about your writing process, because formal poetry often can require a lot more in the way of revision and craft. Sometimes it comes out, it spills out, but more often than not, it doesn't. How do you go about writing a poem?
I find my best poems kind of come from one good line, and where I'll just like the way it sounds. I go a lot by sound, and also just the rhythm of the lines. Like, I love pentameter, as you've noted through the years. It's just my favorite, and like reading Milton is just great, and you get into that rhythm of da-dun, da-dun, da-dun. And so that's one of the ways I write, is just by sound, and then using the form to kind of impose the structure. And one of the fun things about writing in form is, if you're not writing in form, you can use whatever word you want. But if you are writing in form, you're kind of pushed to find a word that has the same rhythm or has the same sounds. And it's an interesting point where the poem sometimes takes over and says, well, you weren't planning on using this word there, but once you start to, it opens new doors that you didn't even realize were there. So.
Well, you're a formal poet, and you're also someone who is clearly interested in the local landscape, as we've already said. You're from San Diego initially, and you live in Santa Barbara. What's a Southern California poet?
Oh, that's a big question. One of the things that I've been described as an urban poet, and part of that comes from this idea of freeway culture that I think I was raised in, spending a lot more time on the roads, but also being drawn to the hills and the specific landscape here. Santa Barbara is a lot greener than San Diego, especially now. There were some huge fires a couple of years ago, and it's very black, but those hills are very familiar to me. And I think that it's just the landscape, that combination of hills